The most important question in economics is probably why are some countries rich and some countries poor? Well, geez Louise, that's a big question with no direct answer, and I have no answer for that question. What I can give you, though, are some examples of countries who are relatively poor and made changes to make some massive economic progresses and become much richer than they once were. Here are 10 short descriptions of countries who made economic miracles and became rich. Number 1 is China. Of course, you cannot talk about economic miracles and massively fast growth without at least mentioning China. They've been the fastest growing economy since the 1980s with about 10% average growth from 1978 to 2005. That's a lot of years, 27 to be exact. How could this once relatively poor nation spike to become the second richest nation on Earth? The story starts in 1949 when the Chinese Communist Party came into power. The main goal of the CCP was to transform China into a modern industrial socialist nation. Hey, nowadays they achieved 2/3 of the words from their goal. Between 1949 and 1957, the CCP took from their only real moneymakers in the country through forced seizure of land from prosperous farmers and landlords, turning China from a poor nation to a poorer nation. But there was a plan, a 5-year plan from 1953 to 1957, where through central planning, state ownerships of industries, and forced industrialization, China would become a modern powerhouse. This is the part we expected to fail, but no, their main goal of increased industrialization worked, with production up 90% per year and income up 9% average, and surprisingly, agriculture up 4% average too. But that wasn't enough. From 1958 to 1962, another 5-year plan was made, usually called the Great Leap Forward or a Great Leap Backward more accurately. The goal was to leap all sectors of the economy forward at once, at least both industry and agriculture. The problem was they didn't really have enough money to invest it in both industry and agriculture. They should have only focused on one. Well, there's an easy solution to this, said Mao Zedong, chairman of the CCP. By investing into farming by building irrigation and water control systems, we will make more money, need less farmers, and those extra farmers will be relocated into the factories. In 1958, it looked like it actually might work, but then by 1959, mismanaged water systems and forcing all your farmers away from farms caused a little bit of hunger. About 14 million people died from famine directly from this leap forward. The Cultural Revolution afterwards kept more or less the same policies, this time without foreign aid. Luckily for the pockets and life of the average Chinese today, Mao died in 1976 and Deng Xiaoping, the new leader, opened up to the rest of the world. He liberalized much of China's markets, now allowing people to start businesses and participate in the free market. It also meant the end of forced allocation of labor. The new entrepreneurs, combined with the US now outsourcing many industries to cheap Chinese labor, built industry faster than Mao's plan ever could have. And now China was a major exporter, slowly becoming the cheap factory of the world. Throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, China kept growing and growing, mainly through industry and exports, growing at about 10% per year, becoming the second largest economy in 2010. The reason why it happened so fast within 3 decades was because China was held back from this growth from government policies. The growth would have still happened without them, but likely at a much slower pace like the USA. For reasons that should be their own video, China's economic miracle is now slowing down, but China's growth still marks the fastest poverty reduction in all of human history. Number 2 is currently one of the richest on Earth, Ireland. Sure, today Ireland is seen as a rich first world nation and a tech hub of Europe, but that was not always the case. Ever since Irish independence in the 1920s, their economy has not been doing so hot. Economic nationalism got them into a trade war with their largest importer and exporter, the UK, and import substitution industrialization, basically blocking off imports to grow their domestic industry, led to hurt consumers and a worse off domestic economy, essentially trying to become a protectionist country, but not having a large enough country to make it work. By the 1950s, the economy was fully stagnant. Thousands of Irishmen just left for a better life to the UK, US, or other countries. Their industrialization strategy never really manifested, as Ireland by the 50s was still a primarily agriculture-based economy. Also, not being involved in World War II should be a good thing, right? You know, not having your whole country blown up should be seen as a positive, but it also means they missed out on the post-war boom and much of the subsidies America gave Europe to rebuild the continent. By 1958, it was time for a change. T.K. Whitaker, leader of the Irish Central Bank, made some pretty big changes like accepting free trade and taking in foreign investment, which started the process of Irishment. It did okay, but didn't keep up to population growth in the 70s, leading to increased dependence on foreign investment and increased debt by the 1980s. To solve the debt, Irish leaders increased taxes, which led to the Irish cutting their spending and businesses having to leave the country. Unemployment sat around 20% throughout most of the 80s, and it looks like T.K. Whitaker's liberalization was not going to work in Ireland. There had to be yet another change for Ireland to make it rich in Europe. In 1987, taxes were cut, public spending was slashed, and most importantly, markets were deregulated. What Ireland's new strategy was to make the most business-friendly country in the world with the hope to attract some big, juicy companies and take a slice of their profit. Ryanair boomed inside of Europe, and Ireland managed to fish in some pretty small companies called Intel, Microsoft, and Google. They had switched from an agricultural country to a knowledge-based economy, and the rewards were starting to show. 1995 was when real growth started. Now, the Celtic Tiger was in full force. Ireland went all in on pro-foreign business policies, lower taxes, better management, and a young, tech-savvy, educated workforce were all pretty attracted to tech companies trying to keep costs low. During this period, their income boomed. Ireland passed the UK in per capita income and fished in some pretty big companies like Apple. The new revenues made by the companies translated into more money the Irish had to consume, invest in infrastructure and institutions, and more business. The Celtic Tiger lasted until the 2008 financial crisis, when property and banks in Ireland went kapooey. They recovered well but slowed down the hyper-growth they experienced in the 90s and 2000s. By 2017, Ireland has essentially become the largest tax haven in terms of people on Earth, with an almost 0% tax rate on foreign capital and businesses. Perhaps it was Ireland's small size which made them poor in the first place, but it's also their small size which has let them pursue this pro-business, pro-growth strategy. The third country is in a region not really known for economic growth. It's Botswana. Botswana has been the fastest growing economy on Earth for much of its history, currently at around 5% average growth for the last decade. They have the highest Human Development Index level in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the highest GDP per capita and lowest corruption score in all of Africa. So how did they do it, since there's not much in Botswana? I mean, before the 1970s when this growth started, their population was around 600,000, and you can't really farm here, being very arid. Yet they had to keep agriculture as the main sector of their society for sustenance. This led to Botswana being a very, very poor nation after independence from the UK in 1966. I guess you could say they got lucky because they found massive mineral deposits of diamonds in the 1970s. Sure, you could say they got lucky, but what about the nations who found diamonds like Sierra Leone, and it ended in civil violence over controlling them, and the nation ended up poorer than before? Well, Botswana had some institutions and rule of law in place to ensure democracy would stay in place. They also worked with the mining companies, really just De Beers, to strike a deal for a 50-50 joint venture into the mines, forming Botswana. The government would let De Beers operate freely in Botswana, and De Beers would take half, with the government taking half too. The deals with De Beers ensured that the government would enforce free business rights and property rights, something which is fairly uncommon in sub-Saharan Africa. Although there are currently only 4 mines in the country, Orapa, Letlhakane, Jwaneng, and Damtsha, diamonds made up around 40% of Botswana's GDP in 2000 and are currently the second largest diamond producer on Earth, behind Russia. This doesn't exactly sound like a healthy economy to put all your time and resources into one export. What if diamond demand or prices fell suddenly? Botswana would be in shambles. In addition, diamonds aren't really that labor intensive to get. There are not enough mines in Botswana for everyone to work in them, so unemployment is around 20%. So Botswana invested their extra money into institutions, infrastructure, education, healthcare, and businesses to diversify their economy a little bit. This makes sure there is as little corruption as possible, economic freedom, and budget surpluses, leading to one of the lowest debts on Earth, only 15% of their GDP. Unlike many other more protectionist African countries, Botswana also welcomes foreign investments, such as building a Hyundai factory inside of the country. Tourism and copyright industries are both growing, now making up around 10% of the total economy each. Botswana is a small country that hit gold, or diamonds, and used the profit to invest it into itself rather than having a small group of elites fight over who will control the diamonds for themselves. Number 4 is the miracle on the Han River, South Korea, part of the 4 Asian tiger economies. If only there was a country on Earth who was rich and had an identical poor country right next to them, one not different in culture or geography, but only in leadership and economic opportunities to compare them. I'm not talking about glorious North Korea because that's the best country on Earth, but really, Korea is a perfect example on how to make a country and how to break a country. In the 1950s, both countries were similar in how rich they were, both were destroyed by the Korean War, and both were some of the poorest nations on Earth at the time. Now, let's have them fight, not by a war, but by economics to see which Koreans will be richer, those in a communist dictatorship or in a capitalist dictatorship. That's right, in the 1950s, South Korea was definitely not what you would call a democracy, but it was free market and open, kind of like the modern UAE is today. In 1961, a military coup brought a protectionist economy while also using an export-based industrialization method. That's what you would call a juxtaposition. Through a 5-year plan until 1966, they would expand electricity, steel, oil, cement, and coal production, lower tariffs, fix their exchange rate, and make huge investments into science and technology. The markets were structured into large corporate entities called chaebols. Chaebol literally translates to rich family, and that's what it was. Big family businesses. You might know some of them today. LG, Hyundai, or Samsung are all chaebols. To let these chaebols grow in power, the leaders of South Korea gave them tax breaks, made it legal to exploit workers, and sometimes gave them subsidies. They weren't exactly great for the average worker, but as a way of pulling the South ahead of North Korea, they seemed to be working. One extremely important thing they gave the South was technological innovation, giving educated workers high raises and making a huge incentive to get educated. As they exported the technologies to the world and worker conditions improved in the 60s and 70s, a large middle class formed in South Korea, creating a huge domestic market for the chaebols to create for. The Miraco's growth is one dominated by these massive chaebols. 10 of them were responsible for about 60% of the growth. By 1995, South Korea was the 11th largest economy on Earth from one of the poorest. It wasn't until the Asian financial crisis in 1997 when the growth finally stopped. The domination of chaebols have since shrunk, but they are still the largest part of South Korea today. From 2000 onwards, many high-tech products used in the West come from South Korea, like TVs, phones, electronics, and robotics. In contrast, the North has suffered under a brutal dictatorship which takes any profit the workers earn, usually taking their lives as well. While the chaebol strategy might not have been the best for wealth inequality or poverty in South Korea, they sure seem to be doing way better than the North. Number 6 is, of course, Japan. You see, before World War II, Japan was on the rise, and their new power might have gotten a little to their head. Anyways, they needed to be humbled with 2 big fat nukes. After they were defeated by the Americans, the US went on a huge mission to rebuild everyone's economies and make a big alliance of friends. One of their biggest projects was in Japan, which was poor and destroyed after World War II. Around 40% of their industry was destroyed, with their 1945 production the same as their 1930 production, 15 years behind where they should have been. The Americans controlling Japan started democratizing and making legal changes to the nation. For instance, the Americans demilitarized Japan and using their newfangled New Deal economics made some pretty big trade unions in Japan. In total, they pumped about $1.9 billion into Japan to rebuild food production, industry, transportation, and education. They also had a huge surplus from their now defunct military budget. During the post-war period, Japan grew at about 10% per year, shifting to a much more urban society. Their investments into education created the highest literacy rates on Earth and mass technological progress. If this sounds like South Korea with the technological innovations, it's maybe because Japan also used a family-owned conglomerate system for their markets. These corporate structures were called keiretsu, some today being Mitsubishi, Nissan, Toyota, and Toshiba. The Golden 60s, as they were called, brought lower taxes, a growing social safety network, and huge investments in transportation. It also saw an increase in trade and exports. Japan, being a relatively small mountainous island for their population, is not exactly food or resource rich. By exporting things they can make well, like cars and electronics, they can import things they can't make well, like food and oil. This is also the first thing that slowed down Japanese growth. The 1973 oil shock, when prices tripled, hit Japan harder than most other countries, having almost zero domestic oil production. Production in the whole of Japan shrunk by 20% in 1973, but slowly recovered. By the 1980s, Japanese consumerism was in full swing, just like their mentor, the US. It meant an increase in domestic production, but also of imports needing to export even more cars, computers, and electronics. The trade surplus ended up appreciating the yen, which ended up making financial assets and housing a big bubble which needed to burst, and it did in 1989. The 1990s is when Japan's hypergrowth stopped, usually called the lost decade. It was characterized by an economy which was just lackluster compared to the earlier Japan, creating a wave of sadness for the whole island. Deflation in the 90s meant production was down, and then the Asian financial crisis hit in 1997, and then the global financial crisis in 2008, and then COVID and the recession with it in 2020, and Japan hasn't been doing the best since the 90s. Japan is lucky to have gotten very, very rich before this stagnation, being able to weather it much better than most countries could, as they're still the third richest nation on Earth. Number 7 is the representative from the Tiger Cub economies of Asia, Vietnam. Yes, another East Asian nation on this list. Wow, but you can't deny this region went through one of the fastest enrichment programs in history. Vietnam post-Vietnam War was clearly quite destroyed. Like the Korean War, it was between a communist North and capitalist South, but unlike Korea, the South ended up losing and being taken over by the North in 1975. After the war, the South was a little better off than the North, mainly from the foreign aid they received throughout the war. The two halves of Vietnam after the war did not coordinate production, supply, inflation, debt, or really any part of the economy. There is a suffering population under this due to the mismanagement of these two systems coming together. After the war, it was one of the poorest countries on earth, extremely corrupt, with an elite using power to get rich. So how did they fix this? Of course, like everyone else, through a 5-year plan. They wanted to fund both industry and agriculture through this plan, like a certain other communist Asian country. They couldn't afford it and it ended up failing, not like China's though, since they didn't completely rework their whole agricultural system. To fix this, they did another 5-year plan, this time to get some juicy foreign investment from both communist and Western nations through initiatives for foreign companies to use Vietnamese labor. They had hoped for about 7.5 billion US dollars in investment and ended up only getting around 5. That's not bad when you consider their GDP was only about 2.5 billion though. Part of the program to attract Western powers was to essentially bring back a temporary return to capitalism in the South until they could afford to make it communist again. But after it ended up being the fastest growing region and richest region of the country, they reconsidered their whole plan. So in 1986, the Communist Party gave up, and through a program called Doi Moi, they would transform into a socialist-oriented market economy. They got rid of agricultural communes, price controls, and let their farmers sell their own products. Like the other Asian nations on this list, Vietnam industrialized mainly through exporting to the world with cheap labor. Unfortunately, they had almost no industry coming out of Doi Moi, being a farmer-focused economy. Through their building of industry and factories in the 90s, Vietnam grew at 7% per year, poverty was cut by a third, and they started to become a manufacturing hub of the world, especially of clothing. Vietnam was not hit as hard as South Korea and Japan by the 1997 Asian financial crisis, but it still made them more cautious and cut their spending. Then, in 2000, the largest reform since Doi Moi happened. Vietnam and the US made a deal for Vietnam to gain access to the US market. By exporting to the bottomless consumption pit known as Americans, Vietnam became the second fastest growing economy throughout the 2000s. So like China, Vietnam got rid of their communist ideas and opened up to the world, which, who would have guessed, got them out of poverty and made them much, much richer. Number 8 is one of the only countries to avoid the oil curse, Norway. Whenever most countries find oil, it ends up in the hands of a few elites, which leads to inequality and civil fighting for which group of elites gets to control the oil production. See, during the Middle Ages, Norway was somewhat of a backwater of Europe. It was hard to live there, the weather only let you farm for around half the year, and the rugged terrain gave it a small population. Until the Industrial Revolution, Norway focused on wood, agriculture, and fish, which isn't the epitome of wealth. However, being close to England and being relatively open to change, Norway was one of the first nations on earth to industrialize. This shifted Norway to an urban, working-class country, and when working-class people are concentrated together, they start to get ideas. Ideas about a better working life. It led to post-World War II, Norway being one of the pioneers of social safety with Medicare, retirement benefits, and disability benefits through a progressive tax system made by Einar Gerhardsen. To do this, Norway had taxes galore. There were taxes on cars, tobacco, alcohol, and most importantly, income. The only problem is, by the 50s, they weren't exactly that rich, around 10 to 20,000 US dollars per capita, and got a lot of the revenue through the American-funded rebuilding plans to Europe. They ended up cruising along just fine until something changed Norway forever. They dug into a sweet spot of oil in the North Sea in 1967. Norway used their huge budget to invest into the oil industry and set up a government-owned oil company, Statoil, to use revenues for their welfare programs. They declined joining OPEC and the EU in this time so they could have full control over this oil strategy. Unfortunately, because of high cost to build rigs, refineries, and ports, it didn't actually turn a profit until the late 80s, but oh boy, when it did turn a profit, Norway was set. GDP per capita started skyrocketing, much ahead of the rest of the Nordic countries, even over twice as much as Finland today, spiking from around 30,000 to 80,000 in 2 decades. Even though trade and markets are very liberal in Norway, they still keep the oil industry nationalized so that they can keep their welfare programs with much lower taxes than previously in their history. Compared to other Western nations, it also makes their debt so much smaller, sitting around only 36% of their GDP, as the government doesn't need to borrow from anyone, only oil. Norway is likely the only country to do oil nationalization right, and is likely one of the only countries who can do it right. The 9th country is easily the poorest on this list, but that doesn't mean it hasn't made progress. It's Rwanda. In fact, it's likely also the smallest gain out of any country on this list, but the state Rwanda was in during the 90s was abysmal compared to what it is nowadays. Throughout the 60s and 70s, Rwanda's economy was doing alright. It's a sub-Saharan African country without many natural resources and a heavy reliance on foreign aid. By the 80s, the growth slowed down into stagnation, and in 1986, the IMF suggested a structural adjustment program. The salaries of the Rwandan educated elite were cut and purchasing power decreased significantly. The goal was for this wealth to end up in the hands of the poorest sections of the country, but that never happened when Rwanda decided to do a little bit of genocide. The Rwandan genocide absolutely destroyed the country and countless lives. The only real way the people were staying alive was through humanitarian relief funds from outside countries. After the genocide and civil war was finished, the nation was in complete poverty, especially among Rwandan women. Then, in 1996, Rwanda embarked on their reconstruction mission. They reduced their dependence on farming and shifted into more manufacturing for African and Middle Eastern countries and service industries. With liberalizing trade to foreign nations, Rwanda was able to achieve a 30% growth in 1996. By 1997, the continuation of that strategy had brought 75% of their industrial power back, and many refugees who escaped were coming back to start up businesses in the more friendly Rwanda. The friendlier Rwanda included guarantees you would be able to take out a loan, economic freedom, and privatization of government-run corporations. The real boom didn't come until 2006 though, under Paul Kagame's government, when Rwanda started making a big shift into services. Services today make up around 45% of Rwanda's economy, while industry is only 14%. Under Kagame, Rwanda invested in education, with youth education making up around 17% of the entire government's budget, infrastructure, and fighting corruption. The best thing an African country can have is infrastructure to do business on, and the guarantee that your profits won't be taken by a corrupt police officer. This made Rwanda one of the most attractive countries in all of Africa to invest in. Today, it ranks as the second easiest country to do business in Africa, behind Botswana. Who knows if Paul Kagame's idea to make Rwanda the Singapore of Africa will come true, but so far, they're doing some pretty good progress. The last country on our list is a representative of the Baltic Tigers, Estonia. The Baltic Tigers were the growth of all 3 of the Baltic states post-independence from the USSR, yet Estonia grew the fastest and is right now richer than Latvia and Lithuania, so it is the one on this list. Under Soviet rule, Estonia was centrally planned and their industries were collectivized. Their main focus is agriculture, phosphorites, and especially shale. But hold on. As we have seen, maybe communist countries don't work and tend to fail, and the USSR seemed like it was desperate for a change. As the Soviets were democratizing, Estonia and its Baltic brothers gained their very own independent countries. I'm sure you can guess how the growth happened after watching 9 other of these sections. Under a freer market structure and less extractive elite, Estonia's people were able to sell what they had produced to become much richer than they were before. Specifically, the leaders of the Baltic Tigers did 4 things. 1 was to always balance the budget. 2 was run a national audit fairly often. 3 to create a central bank, something missing being part of the Soviet Union. And 4 establish a national currency. Their specific currency at this point was the kroon, pegged to the German mark at 8 to 1 or 15.6 to 1 after the euro replaced the mark. Being in a politically wanted region as the link between the West and the East, Western powers invested highly into Estonian industry, being the cheap labor source for Europeans. To encourage this investment, Estonia also used a flat income tax and very liberal trade with almost no tariffs to the EU. Even better than trading with the EU was to be inside of the EU, and when they joined in 2004, growth spiked even faster at around 10% per year. The funny thing about the EU is that trying to join it usually does more for a country than actually being in it. To be accepted into the EU, your nation needs to be fully democratic, have an incredibly stable economy, and be friendly with the rest of the EU nations. You basically need to shape up your country in order to join the best investment opportunity for Eastern European countries. Compared to the rest of the EU, Estonian labor is cheap, which brought companies to their country. Eventually, through all of this investment, Estonia's unemployment fell below EU averages. The tiger boom ended with the 2008 financial crisis, with Estonian property markets hit hard, shrinking output by 16%. Through the continuation of their budget and austerity programs, Estonia has recovered and is now a first world developed nation, starting from the bottom, and now they're here.